Our Father in heaven, we think of the various texts of Scripture which speak of the incomprehensibility of God. And yet, Lord, there are those that speak of His knowability. And we thank You that You have revealed Yourself to Your people. And most beautifully, You have revealed Yourself in the person of our Lord Jesus Christ. We ask now, Lord, that You would help us as we study the attributes and help us to realize and remember that we're talking about a person and not merely an abstract thing. We ask in Christ's name, amen. Okay, last time we began the unit entitled The Attributes of God, an Overview. We went through some preliminary considerations. We talked about the methodology that we wanted to use, looking at a negative approach to the attributes and then the biblical method. And we talked about the validity of studying the attributes. And then as we closed our session, we were looking at the subject of anthropomorphisms. That is, descriptions of God, particularly in the Old Testament, using human terminology. And we began by noting that whether we would approve of that or not, the Bible does have anthropomorphisms when it speaks of God. And we talked about the existence of those anthropomorphisms. And I want to say a word about the validity of them, and we'll follow the printed notes here on page 4. But all this, says France, is not crude, semi-idolatrous thinking. It is just the opposite. It is an expression, the only effective expression, of an intense sense of the real presence and dynamic activity of the living God. It was precisely because they knew God not as a static idol or as a metaphysical theory, but as one to be reckoned with, that they use this forceful imagery. What abstract phraseology could you coin to compare in vivid reality with this? Smoke went up from his nostrils, and devouring fire from his mouth. Glowing coals flamed forth from him. He bowed the heavens and came down. Thick darkness was under his feet. He reached from on high, he took me. He drew me out of many waters. He bowed the heavens. Indeed, is it not true that the better we know God, in experience as well as in theory, the more meaningful and precious such language becomes to us still? Is it an accident that we still use such phrases as walking with God to convey a depth of spiritual experience which is far removed from primitive idolatry? To the men of the Old Testament, God was real. They knew Him. And the clearest way they could express it was in the language of human personality and activity, not in cold metaphysical jargon. All honor to them. If we knew God better, we might find our tidy theological formulations less than adequate. God has a way of breaking loose. Number 3, the necessity of anthropomorphisms. Such anthropomorphisms are necessary if man is created in God's image, which he is. The use of anthropomorphism should not surprise us. We are personal, rational beings. So is God. We have minds, volitions, and emotions. So does God. We do not have the capacity to understand a spirit being apart from this kind of revelation. So it's necessary that we say something about the anthropomorphisms and their validity. Now, in the outline, Roman numeral 2, the definition of the divine attributes. The word attribute is not really ideal, since it conveys the idea of adding something or assigning something to one. Therefore, it gives the impression that we are adding something to the divine being. Berkhof prefers the word properties or perfections. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. Let's just take a look at that. We looked at it last time, but I want to have you see it again. In 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9, the apostle writes, "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, so that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who has called you out of darkness into his marvelous light." Now, the King James Version has praises, but I prefer, and I think better, the NASB with its translation, excellencies. And that's really probably as close to the right word that we're going to have in describing the attributes of God, the excellencies of God. Now, in defining the attributes, in the outline, capital letter B, what the attributes are not. What the attributes are not. Number one, they are not to be distinguished from the divine essence. Here we come to a matter of some dispute among Bible teachers, theologians. Some theologians devote separate discussions to the being of God, the essence of God, and then they have another section which they devote to the attributes of God. What is this essence of God that they single out or distinguish from the attributes? Well, Kuyper says that it is wisdom. He based this on Proverbs 8, verse 14. Others say that the essence of God is being itself, based on the burning bush episode in which the Lord tells Moses that his name is I am that I am, or I am who I am. So the essence of God is self-existence. Others say that the essence of God is spirit. They base that on John chapter 4, God is spirit. However, as Berkhof notes in his theology, Scripture does not exalt one attribute at the expense of another. Frankly, I think it's probably unwise to attempt to distinguish the essence of God from the attributes of God. William Shedd says this, and Shedd is one of my favorite among the older theologians. Shedd says the attributes are an analytical and closer description of the essence. So he doesn't separate the essence from the attributes. He just simply says the attributes are really a description of the essence of God. Bavinck agrees. Every attribute is identical with God's being. He is what he has. He is what he has. Berkhof. In a sense, they are identical, so that it can be said that God's perfections are God himself as he has revealed himself to us. So we're not to think that the attributes of God add to the essence of God, or that the removal of one would in some way take away or divide up the essence of God. Shedd again. God is not essence and attribute, but essence in attributes. The whole essence is in each attribute, and the attribute in the essence. So these writers, and I think correctly, so far as I understand the issue, we should not distinguish the attributes from the essence of God. The attributes, in fact, are a description of the essence of God. God has revealed himself to us. And that revelation is not false. It's a true revelation of who he is and what he's like. Number two, they are not parts of the divine essence. They are not parts of the divine essence. God cannot be divided into parts. When I was a student at Dallas Seminary, there was a very well-known pastor in Houston, Texas. He was the pastor of Baraka Church. His name was Bob Thiem. He was a very colorful character. He had graduated from Dallas Seminary, but he had his own unique way of explaining theology. He had his own terminology. For example, when he would talk about the fact that a person would be restored to fellowship after, if a Christian, for example, sinned and felt they were out of fellowship, when they confessed their sins, Bob Thiem called that the doctrine of rebound. Well, it was just, he had all these kinds of expressions, terms. Well, when he came to the attributes of God, he described God as an essence box. It's almost like a pack of cigarettes, you know, where you could just pull out one attribute and another attribute out of this essence box. I don't think we should say that they are parts of the divine essence. God is free from compositeness. There's one essence to God. And we'll say more about that when we get to the attribute of God's simplicity. Number three, they are not persons. They are not persons. The attributes of God are not persons. We should not think, when we talk about the attributes, that they are the personal distinctions of the Trinity, that the Father is one attribute, the Son is one attribute, the Spirit is another attribute. These personal distinctions belong to the particular persons, not to the essence of God as a whole. The Father is not the Son is not the Spirit, and so on. We make these careful personal distinctions when we're talking about the triune God. These three persons are three eternal subjects in the Godhead. However, all the attributes belong to each of the persons. Now, that's what makes that's why we can say of each of the persons that they are fully God, because they have the attributes of God. Now that brings us to the next heading, capital C, what the attributes are. Shedd again. The divine attributes are modes either of the relation or of the operation of the divine essence. They are, consequently, an analytical and closer description of the essence. So I like that. I think that's getting us close. Just the tail end of that sentence of sheds, they are an analytical and closer description of the essence of God. Charles Ryrie, Dr. Ryrie was always known at Dallas Seminary for very pithy type definitions. He liked to have things summarized very tightly. He was one of those theologians. He had 2 doctor's degrees, but he was one of those theologians who really was aiming at the man in the pew. He liked to speak in language that was easily understood. Ryrie says an attribute is a property intrinsic to its subject. An attribute is a property intrinsic to its subject and by which the subject is distinguished or identified. Now, Dr. Ryrie was a Baptist, and so I'm going to give you another Baptist, A.H. Strong, to show you how we can go from simplicity to a more complex definition. Strong said of the attributes that they are, quote, those distinguishing characteristics of the divine nature which are inseparable from the idea of God and which constitute the basis and ground for His various manifestations to His creatures. They are the fundamental qualities or powers of His being. And then I like that. I like the end of that. I think that we can dispense with most of the sentence and just say that the attributes are the fundamental qualities or powers of the being of God. Dr. Lewis Johnson, I'll just give you one more, who was one of my revered teachers at the seminary as well. He said that the attributes are the perfections which are predicated of the divine essence in the Scriptures, or visibly exercised by God in His works of creation, providence, and redemption. So they are His perfections, statements about His divine essence, and they are also His seen in the powers that He exercises as He creates and redeems and so forth. Now, if you want to stick with something simple, you can. We'll stick with Ryrie as a nice pithy definition. One Christmas, or before one Christmas time, some of the students at the seminary put up a notice of courses that would be offered the following semester. And they were all very humorous. They picked traits of some of the more well-known professors. And they said that Dr. Ryrie would be offering a course in theological writing. And they said during the course he would show you how to summarize all of Louis Sperry Chafer's 8 volumes on one side of a 3x5 card. Well, slight exaggeration, but that was what he was known for. Now, the next page, I have some of the common classifications of the attributes of God, and I want to talk to you about these. And you can check the library or your own library, but the library, the reserve shelf, to look at these volumes. The following discussions are particularly important. They're very good. Stephen Charnock's 2 volumes, Discourses upon the Existence and Attributes of God. 2 volumes on the attributes. I remember hearing Chuck Swindoll saying he was at a conference and he challenged people to read through Charnock. And he said a couple of years later at the same conference ground, a guy came up with a big smile on his face and said, "Well, I did it." He says, "Well, what did you do?" He said, "I read through 2 volumes of Charnock." Mr. Glock likes to read portions of Charnock regularly. So Charnock is probably one of the most well-known works in English. Herman Bavinck's book, The Doctrine of God, it's now included in the 4-volume complete works of the complete theology, but for a long time the only part of Bavinck that was available was this section on the doctrine of God. And then Berkhoff, Louis Sperry Chafer, Charles Hodge, William Shedd, A.H. Strong, Millard Erickson, Wayne Grudem, John Feinberg, John Frame. That'll give you a nice cross-sampling of evangelical and/or Reformed type works on the attributes of God. The first group belongs to God alone, such as infinity. And the second group are found in a limited and relative sense in man, for example, love. It's sometimes suggested that in the first group, God is seen as related only to himself in a passive way, such as self-existence. In the second group, however, the essence is seen in action. Now, I'm just going to go over these with you. I am going to use one of these methods, and I'm going to confess to you right at the beginning, I'm using it simply because it was the method I was taught. And there's no other reason why I'm doing it. And you can take issue with me if you'd like, or pick another one if you would. Here's how they are grouped by different theologians, and the footnotes will tell you or give you an example or two of the writers who use these categories. Some divide the attributes into natural and moral attributes. The natural attributes belong to the constitutional nature of God as distinguished from his will, self-existence, simplicity, infinity, and so on. The moral attributes qualify him as a moral being: truth, goodness, mercy, justice, holiness. They relate to the concept of rightness as opposed to wrongness. A word of critique: the so-called moral attributes are just as natural or original as the others. In light of this criticism, Dabney, Thiessen, Feinberg prefer the term moral and non-moral attributes. Second, personality and constitutional attributes. Personality attributes include intellect, omniscience, sensibility, including holiness, justice, love, goodness, truth, will, including freedom and omnipotence. And then the constitutional attributes, these are predicables of his essential being. They are statements, in other words, about his essential being. They are not communicated to other beings. These include simplicity, unity, infinity, eternity, immutability, omnipresence. Then others divide the attributes into absolute and relative attributes. The absolute attributes belong to the essence of God as considered in itself, included our self-existence, immensity, eternity, and so on. The relative attributes belong to the divine essence considered in relation to his creation, included our omnipresence, omniscience, goodness, mercy, and so on. Criticizing this, Berkhoff said, this division seems to proceed on the assumption that we can have some knowledge of God as he is in himself entirely apart from the relations in which he stands to his creatures, but this is not so. The only way we really know about God is in the way he acts toward us. Others use the category immanent and eminent attributes. Now we sometimes talk about the imminent return of the Lord, meaning it's going to be soon. This is not that word. This is spelled differently. This is the word immanent, an A instead of an I. And to abide is the idea, immanent. These attributes do not go forth and operate outside the divine essence, included are immensity, simplicity, eternity, and so on. Eminent, to abide out from, to emerge attributes, these issue forth and produce effects external to God, included are omnipotence, goodness, justice, and so on. And in explaining why they don't like this category, some say that if some of the attributes are purely immanent, all knowledge of them would seem to be excluded. How would we even know about them? Positive and negative attributes. Positive attributes belong in a finite degree to man, included are holiness, truth, love, goodness, mercy, and so on. Negative attributes, these deny all finite defects and imperfections to God, included are unity, simplicity, immutability, and so on. You'll notice, by the way, as we're going through these different lists, that the attributes seem to fall in the same, they all fall together. In other words, in one set of, in one system, you'll find a certain group of attributes, and then you'll go to another system and the same ones will be grouped together. Some have used the expression quiescent and operative, or passive and active attributes. Quiescent attributes, these attributes have no effect upon and no relation to the world. They remain in the Godhead, included are eternity, simplicity, infinity. Operative attributes, this term denotes an action, an operation upon, a relation to the world, omnipotence, omniscience, justice, mercy, and so on. And then finally, we come to the particularly category that I use, and as I said, I use it simply because this is the way I first learned the attributes, and I've been too lazy to go back and refine anything. The incommunicable attributes, these have no analogy to the creature, included are self-existence, immutability, infinity, unity. The communicable attributes bear some analogy to human nature, power, goodness, mercy, righteousness, and so on. A critique, those who oppose this breakdown will say that none of the divine perfections are communicable in the infinite perfection in which they exist in God. At the same time, there are faint traces in man even of the so-called incommunicable attributes of God. So writes Berkhof. Now my conclusion will differ a little from yours. I've been tweaking the notes as I've been going along. The above sevenfold classification systems are all subject to the objection that they apparently divide the being of God. The objection loses some of its force when we remember that the attributes of the first class qualify those of the second. For example, His goodness is immutable, infinite, simple, and so on. Further, none of the attributes of God are incommunicable in the sense that there's no trace of them in man, and none of them are communicable in the sense that they are found in man as they are found in God, again quoting Berkhof. Hodge expressed the exasperation of many over the various systems of approach when he wrote these words: "On few subjects have greater thought and labor been expended than on this. Perhaps, however, the benefit has not been commensurate with the labor. The object of classification is order, and the object of order is clearness. So far as this end is secured, it's good. But the great diversity of the methods which have been proposed is evidence that no one method of arrangement has such advantages as to secure for it general recognition." In a similar vein, Charles Ryrie wrote, Categories may serve some purpose, but in my opinion, not much. Now, Hodge had his own proposal, and in his own proposal, he followed the Westminster Catechism. He said, "It is proposed in what follows to accept the guidance of the Westminster Catechism to the question, what is God?" And that's an actual question in the Catechism. Question 7, and I'll just read this to you. You don't have it in your notes. But question 7 in the larger Catechism asks, what is God? And then the Catechism gives you the answer. God is a spirit, and of himself infinite in being, glory, blessedness, and perfection. All-sufficient, eternal, unchangeable, incomprehensible, everywhere present, almighty, knowing all things, most wise, most holy, most just, most merciful, and gracious, long-suffering, and abundant in goodness and truth. Which Hodge felt was about the best definition of God that he'd ever read. Now, that's a good definition, but I think if we were to go through that definition, it would be good to go to the Bible and give you examples of each one of these, which of course Hodge does, so that the definition doesn't become just a kind of a cold metaphysical thing, but it has some personality to it. Hodge writes, "It is proposed in what follows to accept the guidance of the Westminster Catechism to the question, what is God? It is assumed in that answer that God is a self-existent and necessary being, and it is affirmed of him, 1, that he is a spirit, 2, that as such he is infinite, eternal, and immutable, 3, that he is infinite, eternal, immutable, 1, in his being, 2, in all that belongs to his intelligence, namely in his knowledge and wisdom, 3, in all that belongs to his will, namely his power, holiness, justice, goodness, and truth. Whatever speculative objections may be made to this plan, it has the advantage of being simple and familiar, at least to the people who were brought up with the Westminster Catechism." Now on the next page, what I have done is I've gone through some of the leading writers and have listed the categories that they have. I've gone through Hodge. Notice he uses just the Westminster Catechism breakdown. And then Bavinck uses incommunicable, communicable. Louis Berkhoff, the same. Shedd, the same. Strong uses absolute and relative attributes. Louis Sperry Chafer, constitutional and personality. Francis Pieper, negative and positive. Millard Erickson divides them into attributes of greatness and attributes of goodness. And Wayne Grudem breaks them down into incommunicable and communicable attributes. Yes? Nate?
What is the purpose for the classifications of God's attributes? Like, what purpose does it serve theologically other than making a list of incommunicable and incommunicable?
Well, I think that Charles Hodge tells you what the purpose was when he says the object of classification is order, and the object of order is clearness. Now that is the object that these people all have in using these systems, but as Hodge goes on to say, the great diversity of methods raises some questions about whether we have really been orderly and whether we've really been all that clear. So that's the purpose of doing it. Whether they've been effective, that's another question altogether. I do notice, by the way, and you will notice too, that in some of the, in the cross spectrum of writers that I've given you, some of my favorite theological writers, that the incommunicable and communicable background probably predominates. Even with a very up-to-date, modern, contemporary like a Wayne Grudem. Okay, today we are going to continue our study in the attributes of God, and the lecture title today is The Incommunicable Attributes, Part 1, The Self-Existence of God. Now this is a rather extended series, really, in our course on theology proper, dealing with the attributes, the perfections, the properties, the excellencies of God. And today we begin a survey of the so-called incommunicable attributes. Now remember, there are these two categories which many, not all, theologians use of incommunicable and communicable attributes. The incommunicable attributes are those properties of God which have no analogy to the creature, such as immutability, because immutability means that God is absolutely changeless. Well, that's certainly not true of us. As well as infinity, unity, and self-existence. We certainly are not self-existent creatures. The communicable attributes bear some analogy to human nature, goodness, power, mercy, righteousness, and so on. So today, we want to begin a study of the first category, the incommunicable attributes. And as we begin these, I want to repeat something that I said last time. These categories are not absolute, which is why some, like Hodge and others, have just dropped the whole idea of categorizing them. None of the attributes are communicable in the infinite perfection in which they exist in God. At the same time, there are some traces of the so-called incommunicable attributes in man. Second, as again I intimated last time, there is not complete agreement among the theologians on which attributes belong in which category. Even those theologians who break it down into incommunicable and communicable attributes, they don't always agree as to which ones are incommunicable and which ones are communicable. So there's not only disagreement as to the two major categories, but there is disagreement over which attributes belong in the two classifications. Fortunately, there is a great deal of agreement on the individual attributes. And so for that we can be thankful. Now, this time we are going to confine ourselves to just one of the attributes, namely the self-existence of God, or the independence of God. And first of all, the history of the doctrine. Capital letter A in the Middle Ages. During the Middle Ages, Anselm, the Archbishop of Canterbury, 1033 to 1109, spoke of the aseity of God. The word aseity is derived from the Latin aseatas, which is made up of esse, to be, and esse, ase, being from oneself. And this was distinguished using an expression, esse ab alio, being from another. God is not esse ab alio, from another. God has aseity, that is, he does not derive his being from anyone else. Another expression that was used and is used is causa sui, his own cause. God has the ground of his existence in himself. Capital letter B in the outline, in the Reformation period. In Lutheran writers, the term aseity gave way to independence, although the idea of aseity was affirmed. Reformed writers, that is those in the school of John Calvin, tended to lay even greater stress on this idea of independence and thus substituted the word independentia for aseitas. The term aseity merely expresses that God is self-sufficient in his existence. The term independence says that God is self-sufficient in everything, namely his existence, his attributes, his energy, his decrees, and his works. He's independent in his knowledge also. He has no teachers. His wisdom is as original as his nature. So God differs from all other beings. Only God is independent in his existence as well as in his works, decrees, and so on. Every creature is dependent. Now, but we may want to act independent. People who gather great amount of wealth or they gather immense power politically may want to feel that they are totally independent, but ultimately those things fade away and they realize that they are not so. So God is independent. Now, we should add a little caveat here. There is a faint trace of independence in the creature. He's absolutely dependent, yet he has a distinct existence and strives towards self-preservation. And so he may, for example, get to a point where he's independently wealthy. So he goes out and plays the lottery and he wins $500 million. And so he thinks, I'm absolutely independent. I'm not dependent on anyone for money. Well, he's still dependent on people for a lot of other things. Dependent on people to raise the food that he eats, make the clothing that he wears, build the automobiles and boats and everything else that he drives. So he's not ultimately independent. In the outline, Roman numeral 2, the philosophical arguments for self-existence. A, introductory considerations. Principally, this doctrine of self-existence involves a negation of a cause for being. In short, the law of cause and effect does not apply. Every effect must have a cause, but God is not an effect. Someone has said, the understanding is paralyzed, but faith is not staggered. He is the uncaused being. Two common mistakes must be avoided. First, we should not say that God is his own proper cause, causa sui, his own cause. Some have used this, by the way, when they describe this attribute. Shedd, among others, protests the use of this particular phrase. We cannot say God originates himself because this would involve existence and non-existence at the same time. God, however, had no beginning of existence. Shedd, I think, is correct. Strong allows the term, that is A.H. Strong, causa sui, but defines it as meaning that the ground of God's existence is not outside himself. Second, we should be careful what we mean if we say that necessity is the ground of God's existence. God does not exist because he must be. There's no necessity outside his own nature. There's no list of rules of things necessary, and number one, well, God is necessary. That you cannot say. The pre-Socratic atomists, we'll go to point 5, taught a law of necessity. Necessity is the efficient cause of everything. They believed in certain laws that even the gods had to answer. For example, fate, necessity, justice, and so on. If the gods violated the laws, they incurred retribution. None of this is true of the Lord, of Yahweh. There are no laws over him to which he answers. Whatever necessity or justice there is in his very nature, not above him. Nothing is apart from God, whether space, motion, time, causes, forces, or existence. So I reject the atomist's idea of necessity as applied to God, yet God does exist necessarily. God does not merely happen to exist, he must exist. His non-existence is impossible. He must exist if there is to be any meaning in the world. Well, actually, he must exist if there is to be anything in the world, actually. So from our point of view, from the point of view of the created order, God is necessary. But as far as his own existence, there's no law of necessity that required that somehow he come into existence. So God must exist if there's to be any meaning in the world. He's the basis of all reality, all rationality, all truth, all goodness, all beauty, and all logic.